Good evening, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed your snow day if you live on the East Coast. Uh, you're all muted for this webinar, and we will be taking questions at the end, so I'd be happy to answer all your questions. You could type them into your question area on the screen. And welcome to End the Struggle, Conquering ADHD, Learning and Behavioral Issues. And the title is quite appropriate because it is a struggle. And we know that people who work with children with different developmental issues, teachers, professionals, parents, and mostly the children we work with are struggling. So I'm very excited to be here tonight to discuss current brain research and our brain-based approach to helping children with various neurodevelopmental disorders. And when I talk about these disorders, I'm talking about issues such as ADHD, dyslexia, learning disabilities, sensory integration dysfunction, obsessive-compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, autism spectrum disorders. But we're going to understand that we're not here to really diagnose these disorders because they all have one specific underlying cause. So tonight I'm here to give you answers as to why we're facing the largest epidemic of childhood developmental disorders in history. And again, we're going to be discussing various types of disorders, but tonight I also speak to you not only as a clinician, but as a parent. And there's been more research in the last 20 years than any other time in history on these issues. So hopefully tonight I'll be able to share some of this research with you, because the more we all understand what's happening in the brain in children with these disorders, the more we'll be able to share information and help our kids. So clearly it's very frustrating for anyone who has these types of issues. It's frustrating for parents, it's frustrating for our educators, and again, most importantly, it's frustrating for our children. It's very frustrating when your daughter comes home, excuse me, when your daughter comes home and tries her best but can't keep up with the rest of the class. When homework that should take maybe a half an hour takes 2 and 3 hours because your daughter is distracted, impulsive, can't sit still, or maybe just has no more endurance or energy left at the end of the day, and then looks up at you and says, "Why am I stupid?" and starts developing low self-esteem. Or your son doesn't get invited to play dates, birthday parties, sleepovers, and you have to walk around on eggshells because you might say the wrong thing at the wrong time, which will set your child to go off into a rage. And then your son will look up to you and say, "What's wrong with my brain? Why was I ever born?" So I don't just say these things as scare tactics. I say them because this is what I hear from parents on a daily basis. Excuse me. So today is about giving you answers, and what we will be talking about today is a very unique, scientifically research-based program that within a matter of 3 to 6 months can change your child's and your family's life. This system, known as the Brain Balance Program, is based on 20 years of neuroscientific research. And what we're going to discuss tonight is really what's going on in your child's brain, or the brain of a child who is having these types of issues. Now, whenever I speak to groups, specifically throughout the state, we're in Connecticut here, or throughout the United States for that matter, specifically when I speak to professionals or teachers, I always ask the question, what's going on in the brain of a child that is experiencing, for example, ADHD? So I get some hands raised, and most of the time the professionals or teachers will say, well, this is a child who's impulsive, distractible, can't sit still, disorganized, very poor emotional control, organizing, planning, prioritizing. And I say, yes, those are the symptoms of a child with ADHD. But what's really going on in the brain of a child with ADHD, and for that matter, any of the disorders we're going to discuss tonight? So what we're going to discuss really is what's going on in the brain, why have these changes occurred, and how we can change these children on a long-term basis and improve their lives without medication. So my journey began because I really was not getting any answers with my own child. So as much as I have researched the brain, I'm a chiropractic neurologist, I'm a fellow of the American College of Functional Neurology, I have a subspecialty in childhood neurobehavioral disorders. I'm one of the pioneers in this theory of hemispheric integration therapy or brain imbalance, but most importantly, I'm a parent. And I witnessed firsthand the inability of physicians and teachers really not to give me the answers I was looking for. So my son, who's very bright, talked very early. He talked at around 8 months, had a very advanced vocabulary, uh, reading comprehension, decoding very advanced. He was like a little professor. But on the other hand, we noted he would be very irritable at times. Certain clothing would bother him. If he had a tag that wouldn't feel right on his neck, or the socks on his shoes, the seam wouldn't be correct, he would rip his shoes off or rip his shirt off. Actually, right now, today, he'll give you the shirt off his back. But we noticed that he had this imbalance of skills of being extremely bright, very literal, concrete, logical, analytical, great memory, great decoder. But on the other hand, these emotional issues, he got along better with kids younger than him, kids older than him, rather than kids his own age. So there are a lot of issues going on, and really I was not getting any answers I was looking for, and this led me on this path to research the brain and find out exactly what is going on in the brain of children who are struggling with these types of disorders. So I spent the last 15 years researching the brain, and really this is the only system that made sense to me from a functional neurological standpoint, because what we're doing and what we're looking at is getting to the underlying cause of these problems, not just dealing with symptoms. And once you know the underlying cause, you could fix the problem. So the question really is tonight, really, what is the Brain Balance Program? Where's the research behind it? And are there any published outcome studies to show that the effectiveness of this program? So the Brain Balance Program is really a specialized educational program where we work with kids with various attention, behavior, academic, social issues, but it's based on an imbalance in maturity in the brain. That different areas of the brain are maturing at a faster, stronger rate, other areas are maturing at a much lower rate, and therefore you have a lack of connectivity in the brain. So certain areas are gifted, and these children are gifted in certain areas, but other areas are not as gifted, and this causes an imbalance. So when we talk about this imbalance, we're really talking about something known as a functional disconnection syndrome. So what does that mean? Well, clearly it's not a physical disconnection in the brain, but functionally the two sides of the brain, specifically the right and left hemispheres of the brain, are not communicating correctly, they're not processing information correctly, and they're not sharing information correctly. So what I'd like everyone to do now, and I clearly can't see all of you out there, but if you would humor me, I'd like you all to push yourself away from your desk or push yourself away from the table, and I'd like you all to stand up. I'll give you about 3 seconds to do that. And once you stand up, what I'd like you to do is just lift your right leg up. And you could keep your eyes open. Try not to hold on to anything, but hopefully you're all able to balance on one leg. So now what I'd like you to do with your legs still up in the air is to close your eyes. Okay. So once you close your eyes, and I can't get a gauge of how many people are going to raise their hands, but I've been doing this for quite a while now, and I know that most, if not all of you, once you closed your eyes, felt a sense of imbalance, felt a sense of disconnection, felt possibly a sense of anxiety. Well, what we've just done is we've taken one sensory system away from your brain, the visual system. So now you can't orient yourself in space. So we've taken one system away from the brain, excuse me again, and what happened was you became disconnected. You felt out of balance. Well, imagine our children on a daily basis having many, 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 many different systems being functionally disconnected from their brains. And now you could get a sense of what a child is going through who has functional disconnection syndrome or this brain imbalance. So you experienced a motor incoordination, basically. But with functional disconnection syndrome, or this brain imbalance, these children are feeling a academic or cognitive disconnection, a emotional disconnection, a social disconnection. So it becomes much, much more deeper than what you experienced just now. So why do we focus on brain imbalance? Because it's an epidemic. Now, most, if not all, of our children are struggling with these areas that you see, and many are not even diagnosed. So we understand that many children don't fit into a specific box. Many children don't fit into the specific checklists that would require a child to be diagnosed with a specific disorder. And that's the problem, is that these kids don't fit into boxes, but they're still struggling. They're struggling with immaturity. They're acting much younger than they should, behaviorally or socially. They're having attention issues as far as being distracted or impulsive. There's emotional reactivity, where they're getting overwhelmed with low frustration tolerance, poor coping strategies. Just the word no could set a child off into a rage. There's social awkwardness, where they're not picking up on body language, eye contact, inflections in voice. They're not picking up on cues in their environment. There are sensory issues. There are learning issues. And again, it's not about being able to diagnose these problems. It's being able to find out where in the brain this is happening, where are the weaknesses, and how could we strengthen these areas of the brain to get the brain to start to mature and connect and coordinate in an appropriate way. So rather than dividing these into separate issues, we want to look at one underlying cause, and that's what we're going to be discussing tonight, which is a functional disconnection syndrome. So why do we function on brain imbalance? Because it's an epidemic. Now, in the 1970s, about 150,000 children were taking methylphenidate, which is Ritalin. Methylphenidate is now known under different types of brand names. But today, 10 million children are prescribed stimulants for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's a staggering statistic. Children in the United States consume 3 times the quantity of stimulants than the rest of the world's children combined. Excuse me for that phone ringing. Okay, I'm sorry. But the problem with that is that when you look at studies on medications and you look at the research, specifically one of the largest studies on ADHD called the Multimodal Treatment Assessment on ADHD, or the Multimodal Treatment Study on ADHD, the result came out that the long-term efficacy of stimulant medication has not been demonstrated for any domain of child functioning. So what does that mean? Well, that means that when a child is on this medication for a long period of time, there are certain changes that take place in the brain, because the brain likes to keep a homeostatic balance between its chemicals, between its connectivity. So when you continue to increase certain types of chemicals in the brain is obviously going to change in its ability to process and connect. And this is why we see long-term effects of these medications have not been shown to be that effective. So we know that there's increased prevalence of these disorders. For ADHD, for example, we understand 11 to 15% of our childhood population has been diagnosed with ADHD. Those are just the ones that have been diagnosed. In some states, specifically Mississippi, South Carolina, Arkansas, 30% of all boys will be diagnosed with ADHD. In some Louisiana counties, that number is approaching 50%. So 50% of children are diagnosed with this disorder. It's the most misdiagnosed condition in American medicine. So again, 1 in 7 children are diagnosed with ADHD. As far as dyslexia and learning disabilities, we see about 15% of children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, 1 to 2%. Over 25% of the childhood population is diagnosed with some form of neurodevelopmental disorder, and this is a staggering statistic. But we understand that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain. So why do I say that? Well, you'd be hard-pressed to find any study to show that there is a definitive chemical imbalance in the brain that's causing any of these disorders, whether it be ADHD, OCD, Tourette syndrome, learning disability, sensory integration, autism spectrum disorder. And what we see in terms of the literature, we understand, for example, what you're seeing now is efforts to identify a neurochemical imbalance in ADHD children have been disappointing. This is the American Psychiatric Association textbook of neuropsychology. Dopamine dysfunction is not the cause of ADHD. This came out in Brain in 2013. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that increases goal-oriented behavior in the brain. It's the chemical that's increased when children take stimulants. It's the chemical that's increased when people take cocaine or amphetamine. Those that took medication actually performed worse in school than those with similar number of symptoms who didn't use medication. This was a study done in Quebec, published in the Wall Street Journal in July of 2013, where over an 11-year period of time, 14,000 children were looked at who took medication, and the result was that over a period of time, children on medication were actually doing worse. Medication use was a significant marker of not of beneficial outcome, but of deterioration. This is Peter Jensen. He was the architect of the multimodal treatment study on ADHD. He was the head of pediatric research for the National Institute of Mental Health. That was after a 3-year follow-up. Research into the use of SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are your antidepressants such as Prozac, Zoloft, things of that nature. So SSRI use in childhood depression is one of confusion, manipulation, and institutional failure. This is The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world. This came out in 2004. So we understand that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain. So if there's no chemical imbalance, what are we dealing with? Well, when you look at the research, we understand that there is a lack of connectivity in the brain. So what the studies show, when you look at functional MRI studies, EEG coherence studies, that there's a lack of connectivity. There's an imbalance in the circuits in the brain. Richard Davidson, who heads up the functional MRI clinic in Wisconsin University, stated that it's a lack of connectivity, differences in specific circuits in the brain. That treatment must not be directed at chemical intervention, that's not specific, but with ways of utilizing specific environmental and cognitive stimulation that are targeted toward specific circuits. Sebastian Sung, who is a PhD, he is at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's a professor of computational neuroscience. Calls it a connectopathy. That's really a great explanation for this, because that's exactly what's happening. It's a problem with connectivity. And if you look in the literature, we see other names: underconnectivity, desynchronization, lack of central coherence. All of this means the same thing. What it means is that different circuits and different areas of the brain are not communicating and coordinating. So if we could find a way to identify areas of the brain that are not maturing and connecting appropriately and build those areas up so we get connectivity in the brain, then this is how we're going to improve our children, and this is how we're going to improve their symptoms. And this is the basis of the Brain Balance program. So when we look at a balanced brain, we understand that the left and right brain are completely different from a processing standpoint. And we see that the left brain basically is more of the logical, analytical, detail-oriented part of the brain. We know this is the part of the brain that is involved in decoding words as opposed to comprehension. The left brain is more of the IQ or the intelligence quotient, where the right brain is more of the EQ or the emotional quotient. And again, very logical. It's the conscious part of our brain. So it's the part of our brain where we constantly talk to ourselves. When we're working out a problem, we're talking to ourselves. We're asking, and children are saying, I always constantly trying to work things out from a verbal perspective. The right brain, however, is more of the big picture part of the brain: spatial, perceptual, emotional, attentional, understanding, abstract reasoning, not word reading, but reading comprehension, making inferences, implied reasoning, cause and effect thinking. Many of our children are great decoders, but when it comes to understanding the big idea, or the inferential aspects of the brain, it's much harder for them. So we understand that the right and left brain are totally different, but they have to complement each other. So what happens is no matter what you call any of these disorders, you could call it ADHD, you could call it obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, no matter what name you give it, we understand that different parts of the brain are maturing at different rates. So that one side of the brain starts maturing faster and stronger, and the other side of the brain is maturing weaker and slower. And this causes an imbalance in skills. It causes areas of the brain really not to connect. And this affects learning, making friends, controlling your emotions, behavior, visual-spatial ability, sports, coordination, balance, depending on what hemisphere is weaker and what hemisphere is stronger. So when we talk about the imbalanced brain, we are talking about a combination of unusually strong skills in one side of the brain combined with weaker skills in the other part of the brain. So looking at this in a general way, we could understand that when we see children with behavior difficulties, being distractible, hyperactive, emotional issues, not really understanding social cues, lacks empathy, hard to make friends, these are things that we see in more of a right brain imbalance. But when we look at children and say there's trouble with learning, reading, decoding, numerical operations, mathematics, memorization, basic academic issues, school-based issues, where these children are better and they are social, they make friends, they're good in sports. This is what we see more when we talk about a left brain weakness. So when we look at signs of imbalance, we could have these lists that we see here, but by no means does a child have to have everything on one list or everything on the other side. There could be a combination of both, but one hemisphere will always be weaker than the other. And by stimulating that weaker hemisphere, we get that side of the brain to start to mature, and now both hemispheres start to share information more appropriately. So when we talk about a right brain weakness, we see kids, again, who could be hyperactive or anxious, awkward, poor coordination, poor nonverbal skills, not picking up on that body language, eye contact, that inflection in voice, those social skills. They can be very impulsive and lack focus, emotional issues. Might be very good decoders, but poor at reading comprehension. Obsessive repetitive behaviors. Why? Because the left brain is more of the approach part of the brain. It's more of the side of the brain, again, as I mentioned before, where you talk to yourself. I have to do this. I have to say this. I can't stop thinking about this. When's my play date coming? Mom, when am I going to get my play date? The right brain is more of the break of the brain. So the right brain tends to shut that down and say, okay, let's wait. Let's be mentally flexible. Mommy said the play date will come in, you're going to have a play date in an hour. Okay, fine. But when you don't have that break and all you have is that other side, then that side becomes overworked. So we call the left brain the gas pedal of the brain and the right brain the brake of the brain. So we understand that if you look at the brain in these perspectives, we see that left hemispheric, with a right brain weakness, we will see left hemispheric skills that are over-accentuated. And when we have a left brain weakness, we will see right hemispheric skills that are over-accentuated. And we have certain indicators that could tell us this. Late milestones, crawling with an awkward crawl, late walking or speaking, persistent infant primitive reflexes, which I'm going to discuss a little later on in the talk. So we know that there are indicators, and these indicators are usually very early in the child's life that could give us a hint or an indication that there is some type of imbalance which could lead to further difficulties as the child starts to mature. So what are these problems? They have the same underlying cause. It's a breakdown of communication between the hemispheres of the brain specifically. So we understand that no matter what you call this, one side of the brain is maturing faster, the other side of the brain is maturing slower. And we like to think of the brain as an orchestra. So if you could imagine 100 musicians on stage, and let's say 10 to 15 of these musicians are playing at the wrong time, the wrong speed, the wrong tempo, how's that music going to sound? Well, that music's not going to sound that good. It's going to sound disharmonious or disconnected. So what you want to do is you want to work with the individual musicians, first identify which musicians are not playing at the right time, the right speed, the right tempo. Start working with those musicians and get them to integrate back into the orchestra so now that music can sound beautiful again. And that's what the brain is. The brain is a symphony. The brain is a symphony of billions of neurons making trillions of connections, and they all have to fire and wire at the right time. That if they're not firing and wiring at the right time, then you will have a discoordination, an incoordination of thought, of behavior, of attention, because the brain is not forming networks the way it's supposed to form. But we also have to understand how the brain grows from birth. Well, this particular slide shows what we like to call the developmental pyramid. And what we see is the base of the pyramid is this idea of primitive reflexes. Well, every baby has inborn primitive reflexes that allows the brain to start to grow and sprout connections and develop. These primitive reflexes are extremely important, and I like to say that they're like training wheels for the brain. So when your child starts to ride a bike, they use training wheels. Now, after the child becomes a little bit more proficient in bike riding, you have to take the training wheels off. If you don't, then your child will not be able to increase their ability and skills in terms of bike riding. Well, the brain is the same way. These primitive reflexes serve a purpose, but should never be found in a child over a year of age. Now, what happens is these primitive reflexes start to develop, but then higher level, sensory, motor, behavioral, social, attentional, cognitive, emotional systems, they all build from these primitive types of infant reflexes, and then these higher level systems reach down and shut down the reflexes. But if you never check or assess to see whether these children have these primitive types of reflexes, you're never going to know if they have them, and if you don't know if they have them, then you're never going to be able to inhibit them. So part of this idea of what we do with children is we need to look at these children from the bottom up. We need to look at all the building blocks of the brain, because that's how the brain develops. The brain develops from the foundation. So imagine a building. You have a foundation. Once the foundation is solid, you build the first, second, third, fourth, fifth floor. But if the foundation is not solid, every floor above that is not going to be sturdy. That's why when we look at our children and we do assessments on our children, we look at many different types of aspects. So we look at dominance profile. We look at these infant reflexes. And again, these infant reflexes should never be found in a child over a year of age. So we need to inhibit them. We look at how the child processes and perceives sensory information through the eyes, through the ears, through the skin, through the body, how they process sensory motor skills, body awareness, cognitive skills. So that we're looking at all these systems and we're seeing how the brain has built from the bottom up, so that the idea is to build up these beginning systems so that higher level systems could take over, and then we start getting appropriate maturity and appropriate processing. So, how do we restore this balance? Well, we don't want to stimulate the already overactive part of the brain. We want to stimulate the weaker side of the brain. But we want to do it using very targeted cognitive stimulation. We want to do it using very intense sensory motor stimulation. Because as we start stimulating the weaker hemisphere starts to improve in terms of its strength and endurance. And now you will start getting improved connectivity between both hemispheres of the brain. Now, this is all natural. Now, chemical types of stimulation, as I mentioned before, does not afford neuroplastic changes. Matter of fact, chemical stimulation actually halts neuroplastic changes in the brain. So it's much like if you went to a physical therapist. A physical therapist is not going to start working with your stronger side. If you have a weak elbow or a weak arm on the right side, physical therapist is not going to start working on your left arm. They're going to work on your right arm. And they're going to build that right arm up until you could use both arms together. And once you start using both arms together, the right side, that right arm, doesn't re-shrink. It doesn't atrophy. It doesn't get worse because you're using it. And that's the point of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to build up the weaker hemisphere so both start connecting. And when both start connecting, as the child goes through growth phases, we start seeing that both hemispheres start to now mature in an appropriate way. So this is all based on the concept of neuroplasticity, which many of you might have heard this term. This is a term that's been in neuroscience for the last 20 years, understanding that the brain can change and grow with appropriate stimulation. So that we used to believe that the brain was a hardwired system, that once the brain was matured or grew to a certain extent, it could not change anymore, but we know that now not to be the case, and we see that not only in children, but we also see it in adults. We see it in stroke victims. We see it in traumatic brain injury. So we know that the brain is quite plastic and can change and grow. Now, the difference between children, adults, is that with children, we're going through growth phases. Adults don't go through growth phases in the brain. So we want to get these children to have improved coherence and improved connectivity while they're going through growth phases. And this gives them the biggest growth and maturity in the brain. But it requires exact stimulation, delivered in the appropriate sequence. The timing has to be correct, has to be repetitive and progressively challenging. This is the basis of the Brain Balance Program. Michael Mersnick, who's the father of neuroplasticity, really did quite a bit of research in this, and you could research quite a bit of information in terms of neuroplasticity and how to achieve it. So what we're really dealing with here are these neurons. So a nerve is like a tree. So you could have a tree with a lot of thick branches and roots, that tree on the left or the nerve on the left, or you could have a tree with very few branches and roots, which is the nerve on the right. Now, the nerve on the right is not broken, it's not diseased, there's no pathology, it's just weak. But the beauty about the nervous system is by stimulating that nerve appropriately, we could actually grow more dendrites or more branches. And when you grow more branches, you get improved connectivity. And when you grow more roots, you get improved connectivity. The way these two neurons are now, they cannot connect, but once you start improving the dendritic growth of these neurons, now you could start getting improved connectivity between different parts of the brain and in the nervous system. So what we like to say is we're moving up this developmental ladder. The goal of the ladder is the end result is what we want to see is improved behavior and cognitive skills. So our children who are struggling either have behavior issues, social issues, sensory issues, cognitive issues, academic problems. That is really the top of the staircase. But what we need to do is we need to work on the basic beginning systems of brain development, because if these systems are not maturing and not functioning correctly, you're never going to get to the top of the staircase. So by improving these basic beginning systems, we move up this ladder of development until finally, when all these systems start to function appropriately, then we start getting improved behavior, improved academics, improved attention, and improved maturity in the brain. So what we do in terms of our brain balance program is we start out with that comprehensive assessment. The assessment takes approximately 3 hours. And what we're doing with an assessment in our children is we're spending about an hour and a half looking at many different sensory motor systems in the brain, about 650 different aspects of functional systems in the brain. The next hour and a half we're doing a full academic cognitive assessment, but not really looking at how smart the child is. Moreover, we're looking at imbalances in the brain. We're looking at imbalances in cognitive activity, imbalances in sensory motor function. We then review the results with parents, and upon enrollment in our program, we have a parent orientation where we go through the guidelines of our program. Now, one of the important parts of our program is that we do want to support children nutritionally. So we have what's known as Balance 360. That's a nutritional program where it's really all about clean, healthy eating. Staying away from high fructose corn syrup, refined sugars, artificial sweeteners, artificial dyes, things of that nature, making sure there is good supplementation for the child. Then children start their half-hour sensory motor sessions, half-hour cognitive sessions combined into 1 hour. So children typically come to our center 1 hour 3 times a week, or possibly 2 times a week. Children have daily exercises they do, 15 minutes a day, 7 days a week. We meet with parents to go over progress with their children at regular intervals. I actually meet with school teachers and staff to go over the results of the assessment so everyone is on the same page and understands the underlying issue as to what's going on with these children, as opposed to just seeing impulsivity, lack of attention, lack of focus, lack of emotional control. We need to show them why these children are behaving the way they do. Children do not have control over this, and we want to give them back control. We reassess children at the end of program, and this is a 3 to 6 month program. Everything we do in the beginning, we do over again and look for significant progress. We review those results with parents. We then follow up the children 9 to 12 months later. And what our longitudinal studies are showing is that children who come back 9 to 12 months later are actually doing better than when they finished. Because the goal is to give these kids access to parts of their brain they're not able to get to right now. And by improving connectivity in the brain, they're now utilizing these pathways more efficiently, and they tend to continue to grow. So what we want to ask now is, where's the research behind the program? Well, there's been a number of outcome studies that we've done. One of them was published in the International Journal of Adolescent Medicine and Health, using this hemispheric remediation. Took 120 kids with documented attention deficit disorder, put them through this program. 82% no longer met the criteria for ADHD going through this program, and there were also improvements in various academic aspects using the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, where we saw improvement in word reading, mathematical reasoning, spelling, written expression, listening comprehension, oral expression, and so on. These were significant improvements. So this is based on peer-reviewed literature. There was a significant improvement. This is not just a mild improvement, but when you talk about significance in terms of statistics, that's a lot stronger than just saying there was some improvement. We also then followed that study up with a study that was published in the Journal of Frontiers in Child Health and Human Frontiers of Human Health, Child Health and Human Development, where we now took a control group of 120 children, put them through an assessment, but did not go through the program. Now we compared the group that went through the program to the group that did not go through the program, looked at them post 12 a year later, and they were actually doing worse than the children who went through the program. So what we need to ask, and we need to look as parents, and we need to say to ourselves, where do I see my child 3 to 6 months from now? Do I see my child being happier, healthier, doing better in the classroom, being more self-confident, or do I see my child continuing to be overwhelmed, frustrated, and developing low self-esteem? If the answer is basically that you're looking at your child and you're really not seeing improvement with a lot of the things you're doing, then I encourage you, if anything I've talked to you about tonight makes sense to you, there are a number of options that you can take. What I'm offering here tonight, for those of you who have been on the webinar, is that our typical assessment, our 3-hour assessment, is usually $300. For people who have been on this webinar tonight, that would be $150, so that's a 50% reduction in the assessment. Or if you feel you want to speak to me personally, have a consultation, tour the center, there is no charge for that, and I'd be happy to sit down with you in the center, which is in Norwalk here in Fairfield County. So you see the number at the bottom of the screen, 203-286-7428, or you could surely email me, and we will get back to you. But either way, my goal is to give you answers, because as I did mention, I was not getting the answers I was looking for. And my goal is to give parents answers first and foremost, because I know a lot of parents are not really understanding or getting answers as to why their kids are struggling. So that's the goal of what I'm trying to do. So at this point, what I'd like to do is open the discussion up for any questions. And let's take a look. So we have a question. Okay, so the first question is from Ariana. And is there any reason why certain demographic areas have higher statistic for ADHD? Well, we understand, that's a very good question, Ariana. So we understand that, these particular issues are caused by what we call epigenetic changes. Now, epigenetics is the science of how the brain is affected by the environment. So we understand that the environment has a huge effect on brain development. When I talk about the environment, I'm talking about the food we eat, toxins, infectious microbes, stress reactions, specifically stress in moms as they're going through pregnancy. So obviously different demographic areas have different stress levels, have different toxic levels, have different aspects of, health and hygiene. So I will also say that this is a widespread problem. You can pinpoint certain areas demographically, but as I said in the very beginning, this is a lot of this is misdiagnosed as ADHD, when in fact, the typical exam for an ADHD for that a physician will give, or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, will be to have a checklist, which is known as the Connor scale or the Brown scale, and if you have a certain amount of checks, you have ADHD. If you don't have ADHD. So I don't know that you have to look at these demographics and say, are they diagnosing them just because it's quicker and more expedient to give them medication and get them on their way, or is there really an increase in ADHD in certain areas? I will tell you, based on the research and based on the statistics, ADHD is homogeneous. It's not specific to any demographic. So whether you come from a very high socioeconomic area or a lower socioeconomic area, you will pretty much have the same amount of kids who have these types of neurodevelopmental disorders. And this isn't just ADHD. This is autism. This is learning disabilities. This is the whole spectrum of neurodevelopmental disorders. Okay, so any health insurance coverage by any chance? So basically this is, our system falls under specialized education, and we do not bill insurance companies. However, there are certain parents who have what's known as health savings accounts or flex plans at work, and many times parents have been able to use their flex dollars to cover the cost of this program. But we do have many, many different ways of paying for this program. There are many different programs that we have, 0% financing programs, other programs, monthly payments. So there's a lot of different avenues to use to pay for this program. But to answer your question, we do not, even though I'm a physician, we do not render a diagnosis, and we do not give out CPT codes or HCFA forms or any of those types of things that would be needed for insurance reimbursement. Okay. Let's see. Please put info back up to make an appointment. Is there a special for 3 kids at a time? Okay, I will definitely do that. Do you expect Husky Insurance to cover the cost of the assessments for families that can't afford paying the regular cost? Well, I will tell you that there have been certain instances where Husky, I do not, I would say no as far as Husky goes. I know Husky is an insurance plan in Connecticut. But there are certain state-run or governmental-run programs that have paid for the assessment for this program. You'd have to look into that. Or you could call me at the center, and I'm going to put that. Hold on, let me put that. This is my first webinar, so if I'm not being technically savvy, I apologize. I'm just going to put that other slide up. There you go. Okay, let me go back to the questions. So the answer to that as far as Husky insurance is probably not, but there are other state areas that do accept, that do pay for the assessment. How the program works to overcome the child's infant primitive reflexes. Okay, very good question. So the way these primitive reflexes are inhibited is that you actually do the reflex. So as part of enrollment in the program, we have, and as I mentioned to you before, the child does have a home program to do. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes, 7 days a week. And part of that home program is to initiate and give you primitive reflex inhibition exercises. Now these exercises are well documented. Goddard and Blythe have done a lot of research on this. They've written many books, books on this subject. So we work with you in terms of giving you specific exercises to inhibit these reflexes. And I will tell you that many physical therapists and occupational therapists work on these reflexes for 1 to 2 years. But because we are very specific in targeting specific sides of the brain and combining stimulation in the right way, most, if not all, of these reflexes are gone within 3 to 6 months, which is quite remarkable, actually, when you think about these primitive reflexes. What is the desired progress? What if the desired progress is not achieved in the 3 to 6 month period? Okay, good question. So, number one, if I accept a child into this program, I am confident that this child will show significant progress. There have been, I wouldn't say many, but there are a number of parents who bring their children in, and I cannot help them for various reasons, and I do not accept them into the program because I don't feel that I will get significant progress with them. But if I do accept a child into the program, it would be very rare for a child not to make significant progress in a 3 to 6 month period of time. I think there might be one child who came for 9 months. They lived in Canada. They actually relocated to Connecticut for me to put their child through the program, and they came actually for 3 summers. So it wasn't 9 months in a row. It was 3 months, went back to Canada, another 3 months back to Canada, another 3 months. Actually, I get emails from them all the time. This child is in the band, he's in karate, he's playing sports. It was a tremendous, tremendous improvement in this particular child. Okay, do you take into account tests that the school has already done, like a neuropsych evaluation? I will tell you that most kids that come to us do have a neuropsych that's been done. However, the information I need to do my work is very specific to the assessment that I do, because clearly a neuropsych evaluation is not looking at functional neurological systems in the brain, like optokinetic stimulation, vestibular ocular reflexes, primitive reflexes, auditory processing tasks. So I take it into account for my knowledge, just to become familiar with the tests that the child has done. I will tell you that most of the times our assessment is consistent with what the test shows from a functional standpoint, meaning that, let's take for example the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which is the WISC. So the WISC will give you a IQ. So we look at the verbal IQ, which is really a left brain function. Then we could look at the perceptual IQ, which is really a right brain function. Now, you could have a child with 140 verbal IQ, which is quite superior, almost genius level, and you could have that same child with a 90 perceptual IQ. Even though 90 is average, there's a 50-point discrepancy in there. So that's a discrepancy between the left and right brain. So I get my information from my assessment, but when I look at these neuropsych evaluations, it's usually consistent I'm just giving you one example of what I look for. I like to look at the whisk just to see the consistency, but I don't use that as an indicator or a barometer or a template as to how I'm going to work with the child, because my assessment is what I need to use, because we look at functional weaknesses and strengths in the brain. Is it possible to arrange a time and date where you can come present at a mental health agency? Absolutely. So you could just call the center and arrange that. I'd be happy to do that. I do that all the time. I talk throughout the state and throughout the country. Are you ever going to open a center in Westchester? Hard to come to Norwalk so often with so many activities. Well, I get that, Dana. And to tell you the truth, we have many, many, many parents in Westchester. So, look, I understand, Westchester is a little farther away. However, there is an end to this. And, I would like to open up a center in Westchester at some point, but there is no center going to be opening up in the near future. But I'm going to tell you, we work with people all over Westchester: Harrison, Chappaqua, White Plains, Larchmont, Rye, all over the place. And once you get into the swing of it, you just do it. And I understand that it's traffic, but we do have a lot of parents from Westchester, and we do make it easy for parents to come as far as timing, and we are open on Sundays. So we're open Monday through Friday and on Sundays. Why would a child not be accepted into the program? Good question. So the idea of being in our program is we do this assessment, and this is a very active assessment. The child has to be engaged and get through the assessment. Do they have to be perfect? Absolutely not. That's why they're coming to us. But I have to be able to get a baseline. And in order to get a baseline, I have to see that the child could make an attempt and try to get through these different activities that we have to have them get through. If they can't, if I see that they can't get through an assessment and I can't get a baseline, then my recommendation to that parent is they're not ready yet. I will tell you that there have been a number of kids who over the years have not been able to start immediately, but we do give them a home program to start doing, almost like a pre-brain balance program. They come back 6 months later or maybe a year later, and then we could start them in the program. This has happened 3 times last year, and it was great because, first of all, the parents appreciate the fact that I'm saying, we can't work with your child, instead of just saying, yeah, everybody, we could help everybody, which is not the case. But we did give this child some activities to do, specifically primitive reflex work, other types of things to do, and then they were able to start the program and did very well. My child has an IEP, so would I want info from the school, I think is what you're asking. Your child has an IEP, so would I want info from the school? All of our kids, not all, but a lot of them have IEPs. The IEP doesn't help me at all. Again, my goal is to see where their deficiencies are in the brain and start stimulating the brain. I will tell you that, unfortunately, the IEP system, my son had an IEP. Look, it's accommodations, modifications, remediations to get the child through their school years. IEPs do nothing to really build up the functional neurology of the brain. So an IEP doesn't help me. The only reason I would, where an IEP would help me is when I go to the school to discuss the student. If I feel the IEP is not adequate, or I feel the child doesn't even have, well, by the way, if you out there, an IEP is an individual educational program that is a federal, based on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's an individualized program that the school would give a child with a learning disability to help them get adequate education. So yes, I do look at the IEP to help the child and to see if it's appropriate, and to maybe, if I see the child doesn't have an IEP or a 504, which is another type of a program, I try to help the child as best I can, kind of like an advocate. But sure, I would like to see it, but it's not going to really affect anything I do in terms of, what my work is going to be with the child. Do they need to be drug-free during your program? My older son is on Vyvanse. and Prozac. My other child is on Concerta. Going to school without drugs while you're doing your program could be problematic. Well, first of all, they do not need to be drug-free during our program. Many of our children are on medication. You're describing a stimulant and you're describing an antidepressant. Both of those, Concerta and Vyvanse, are stimulants. So the fact is that many of our kids are on stimulant medication and antidepressant medication. And as the brain starts to mature, many of our kids can actually reduce or eliminate medication. I actually had a progress report with a child, a parent the other day, who the child was on 20 milligrams of Abilify. That is an antipsychotic medication, and they're no longer on Abilify. So to answer your question, do they need to be drug-free? No, they do not need to be drug-free. So I don't understand going to school without drugs while you're doing your program. Oh, yes, so they do not have to be off drugs while they go to school. They will remain on their medication as we're doing the program. So I would talk to you about that in person, but to answer your question, they would remain on their medication. And then as we move along, we talk about different aspects. What if your child has more than one disorder? Sensory processing disorder, behavioral learning, ADHD, social anxiety. So that is the whole idea, Eric. The whole idea here is that most of our kids have multiple types of symptomatology. And that's the whole idea of the imbalance. When you have an imbalance in brain, you have an imbalance in connectivity, and that imbalance could cause a host of different symptoms, and it usually does cause a host of different symptoms. So even if a child comes in with a diagnosis of ADHD, they might have sensory processing. They probably will have behavioral issues or learning issues and anxiety and social awkwardness. But the idea is not labeling all of these. The whole point here is that kids don't have 5, 6, and 7 diagnoses. It just doesn't work like that. There's one underlying cause, and that is a functional disconnectivity. It's a functional disconnection in the brain. And when the brain is functionally not connecting appropriately, you're going to have all of these different symptoms. So most of our kids have a lot of these different issues. It's just that our society today, and what the current model is when you have a specific symptom, you put a label on it. But that's not really how the brain works, and that's not how you need to look at the brain. And if it was how you looked at the brain, we wouldn't have an epidemic of these childhood disorders that's just going out of control. So to answer your question, Eric, most of our kids do have a lot of these different issues, so that is common. And once we start improving brain connectivity and synchronicity, then those symptoms start to subside and go away. Will the brain mature on its own? You say you help it mature. If left alone, will it happen on its own? It's another good question. So the brain likes to use areas of strength. Now, if there's an area of improved maturity in the brain or increased maturity in the brain and an area of underdevelopment in the brain will always go to the area of strength. The example I like to give with this particular question is that if you could imagine a child being born with one eye that's misaligned. If you don't patch the good eye, the misaligned eye will go blind. Now, why is that? That is because the brain is only focusing on the good eye, and it ignores the weak eye, which is called extinction. The brain goes through a process known as extinction, meaning that the brain ignores or extincts the weaker part of the brain. So if this imbalance is not corrected, then it tends to continue and many times could get worse. So typically, the brain will not, if the brain is out of balance and we see these symptoms happening at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, 9, up to 18, 20, chances are the child will not grow out of it. That's basically what we see there. So that was the last question. If anyone has another question, I'll give another couple of seconds if you want to ask another question, but if not, then I really appreciate everyone listening to this. Again, I'm very happy to speak to anyone. You could call the center either for an assessment or just speak to me. Um, and let's see, what is your background? Okay, what is your background, credentials, specialty? Sorry if I missed that earlier, missed first 15 minutes. Okay, that's quite all right. I'm a chiropractic neurologist. That's a chiropractic physician and an additional 3 years of neurology, culminating in a board certification exam that's sanctified by the state, the writing of a thesis, written exam, oral exams. I then went on to take an additional 300 hours in neurobehavioral disorders of childhood. So I have a subspecialty in neurobehavioral disorders of childhood. I'm a fellow of the American College of Functional Neurology. And I've been doing this now for about 18 years. And again, the impetus of this is I used to work mostly with sports injuries, traumatic brain injuries, but then because of personal reasons and my own son having certain difficulties, I shifted into working with children with neurodevelopmental disorders. The cost after the assessment could vary. It depends on the amount of time, the type of program, whether it's a 3 or a 6 month program. So the cost varies in terms of that. And we could surely discuss that over the phone or personally, or when you come in for an assessment or you come in for a tour. I could lay that out in much more detail for you. So I think that was the last question. Again, I appreciate everybody coming out. Well, you didn't come out. That's the beauty of this. You were able to stay warm in your home. Well, let's see. There is another question. Ever thought of getting involved with helping worldwide epidemic with doing a program for all schools? Yes, Dana. That is one of our goals. That is what we want to do. And we are constantly publishing papers. As a matter of fact, right now we're working with Harvard, Albert Teicher at the ADHD Institute in McLean Hospital. We're doing a control study using hemispheric types of activities to stimulate the brain. This is an independent study being done by Harvard, not being done by us, and the preliminary results are fantastic. So once we start building up more of a research base, I believe that the schools will have no choice but to start using this protocol. We are spending per child on average $50,000 to $60,000 per child per year on special education. It's not, and the child goes when a child starts in special ed in first or second grade, they don't come out till 12th grade. So think of all that money per child, multiply that by what, 14 million? It's astronomical. You could build a wall with that. Somebody mentioned Trump on the next question. So you could build 1 billion walls with the amount we could save if you're into that thing, with the amount we're saving. But yes, Dana, all kidding aside, we absolutely are thinking about getting school systems involved, and there are a couple, very few, but a couple that are involved, and hopefully as time goes on, there'll be more and more and more and more. This is very funny. Get a meeting with Trump and DeVos. Well, DeVos doesn't even know what the IDEA is. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the hallmark, the foundation of special education in our country. Pretty much 25% of our childhood population have IEPs and are in this program, but yet she doesn't know what the IDEA is. So I don't even know what to say about that. Need kids for trials. Oh, I see. Well, right now, it's a possibility. Again, there is a study going on right now up in Massachusetts, and I believe that all the kids, we have enough kids for that, but there are always trials going on. Hopefully, Dana, I'll be able to speak with you, and we could talk further about that. Okay, so, okay. All right, so let's see. I'll give another 2-3 seconds and see if anyone has any more questions. This has been great. I love these questions, and I see everybody's very interested, so I hope to see you guys in person. And if not, if that's it, okay, they just keep coming in. Any plan to reach out to statewide educators so they will understand the underlying issues? The lack of knowledge they have access to is failing our children. You're 100%, Ariana. You're right on the money. I've given lectures throughout the United States. I give lectures to, at least in Connecticut, the Connecticut Association of Teachers, the Connecticut Association of School Counselors. So yes, I reach out to many, many different groups to speak on this topic. When you're dealing with a child with behavioral issues, how do you incorporate the at-home work? Very good question. So as part of our program, I meet with parents, and we do have certain behavioral systems that I work with parents on, their behavioral, their task achievement charts. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. There's a great book called Reconnected Kids. Dr. Melillo, who's a good friend and colleague of mine, wrote the book Disconnected Kids, which I suggest you all pick up a copy. Also Reconnected Kids, which is more of a behavioral book on behavioral aspect of our kids. But I work with parents and work with them and also speak to the kids, and we're always usually able to get through it. So that is something, that's the reason they're coming to us. They're coming to us because their kids are oppositional, defiant, or just don't have the energy to do it, or low frustration tolerance, poor coping strategies. So as they start going through the program, stamina increases, endurance increases, and we work with the parents to be able to come up with different types of ways to have their kids be successful in the program. A lot of times we can do the exercises in the center as well. So each child is different. Each plan is quite individualized, and we really usually never have a problem in terms of that aspect. Okay, I think that the way the Brain Balance Center is set up with the 3 to 6 month process is incredible. I wish there were more ways to promote it to the schools in Connecticut. I know it'll be helpful in the school systems, especially those dealing with a lot of special ed children. Yes, Lloyd. Every school system in Connecticut and in the United States deals with a tremendous amount of special ed children. It's 25% of the childhood population. I would say 20% of the children, and you're probably 80% of the funds spent in a school system is spent on 20% of the children. So, look, these kids need our help. They're struggling. Unfortunately, the current model is antiquated. It's really not working. And fortunately, this system is the only system from a functional neurological standpoint that makes sense if you understand, and I hope you all do now, how the brain works. So little by little, we're going to help one child at a time. Throughout the United States now, we've helped over 10,000 children, and hopefully we'll be helping more and more each day, and that's my goal. So I appreciate everyone here who took the time to listen. Hope you found it educational. God bless you all, and hope to speak to you soon. Okay. Good night.